Hi, this is Mark Gaylor. Welcome to the fifth live Q&A. It's more of a seminar feel, but I'll be looking at the chat pod and I'll try and get to your questions as you ask them. If there's any questions that I can't answer while we're live, I'll make sure I drop back in and answer them after this finishes. This seminar is being recorded, so you'll be able to catch up with this afterwards if you have to leave during the event. There's also recordings of the previous four live seminars available, so if you have time, you can see what we discussed over previous months. Okay, so it's been a little bit of a busy month, not as busy as usual, I have to say. I came back from Japan about a month ago, and I've done one workshop in Western Australia in some sand dunes, but as well as that, I've just been updating my educational support materials for the Alpha community. There's been a few firmware upgrades that have needed my attention to modify my ebooks and my movies so that they're all up to date. Okay, so hopefully I'll get through all of the content, but again, I'll just save any content that I don't get through this week or this month over to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to have to share my screen so you can see some of the images. I did put a link to some Ultra HD images that I upload to Flickr. So because this is broadcasting quite low resolution. So if you need to see the finer details of what I'm discussing, I have put up those images on my Flickr Pro account. Okay, one of the advantages of that Flickr Pro account, and there are other sites that are also like 500px, etc., that list all of the metadata with the images, so you don't have to ask me afterwards what the aperture, shutter speed, or ISO was, because it's all listed there in the metadata. Okay, so we're going to go through a little bit of a Hall of Mirrors effect as I start sharing my screen. So that'll take a couple of seconds before you'll see my images. Okay, so let's just share. And we'll hide this presentation. Okay, so what you should see now is just me in your top right-hand corner of the screen, and I've got some folders that I'll be looking at. I'm going to discuss not just some of the photographs I've been capturing, but also some things that have been hitting the news recently. Okay, so let's grab some of these images and let's just take a look at what I want to discuss. Okay, so first off, after coming back from Japan, in fact, while I was at Japan, a firmware upgrade was made available for the A7 III and A7R3. Just before going to Japan, it was the A9's turn. I have to say the firmware upgrade for the A9 was a lot more significant. There was a lot of changes for the A9, but there were some things that people were pleased to see with the A7 III, and so I had to push those into my free ebook, which has steadily grown to 240 pages or so. And you can get access to that from my website. Just go to downloads, ebooks, and you should be able to get hold of that. This will periodically change over the months. So if you've downloaded a version 6 months previously, you will probably want to come back and download a current version. Okay, so one of the things that was included in this firmware upgrade, and it actually beats the A9, we're still waiting for this feature to arrive for the A9, is Animal IAF. Now, I'm putting a little bit of a teaser here. This wasn't captured with Animal IAF. We're going to have to wait a few more versions or a few more years before Animal IAF gets to the point where we could track the eye of a bird in flight. That's sort of the holy grail for a lot of wildlife photographers, birds in flight being one of the most difficult subjects to tackle. Obviously, the A9 helps a lot with its zero blackout between frames, but anything that will help pull focus on an eye will be great. You can see in this particular image that I captured of this buzzard, the depth of field using a 400 2.8 lens isn't sufficient to cover both the leading wing and the trailing wing at the background, and so being able to pull focus at exactly the right point is obviously one, very challenging, but if we do have any features that make it easier, these will be more than welcome. So really where the animal IAF has been optimized to begin with, and I think this will be work in progress for Sony, is the animals that most photographers will be shooting on a regular basis, and that is our beloved pets, our cats and dogs, etc. And so one of the things that will always happen is if you're not in a spot AF point and you're able to put that spot AF point onto the eye, then typically a camera using a wider AF area will just snap focus on the nearest thing to the lens, which is the nose, typically, if the dog is looking towards you. And so having that feature that just pushes the focus back beyond the nose and onto the eye when we're using our beautiful wide aperture primes is a great advantage. Now, prior to having the animal IF, the technique that I would typically use is DMF. Using again a wide focus area, I would just snap focus, move the focus ring, go into focus assist. That allows me to magnify the view and then just push the focus back towards the eye. It sounds like a complicated workflow, but people who have been doing it for a long time managed to pull this off in just a second or so. So that is quite a good feature. Obviously, where animal IF will be improved, will be an improvement to the workflow is if that cat or dog is moving and we can track that eye in continuous autofocus. So having said that, I did want to push animal IAF in my initial test to see if it would recognize dogs in profile view. Now I have to say the animal IAF was kicking in and out. It wasn't 100% reliable, but again, it's the first iteration, so any help was good. If you probably know my folio work, you probably know that I shoot dogs running or in action quite a lot to test both a camera's AF performance and also lens performance. And so I was really trying to push to see how animal IF would respond to dogs running. And again, I was noticing it was occasionally kicking in. I think most of the time it was I was basically just going to my fallback position, which is my zone AF point and continuous autofocus. Okay, so the other things that I had to do, of course, was I did do a superficial upgrade to my A9 ebook before going to Japan. I only had 2 days to sort of add the new features. I was familiar with most of the new features because I'd been testing the A6400, which had the tracking features, which replaced the lock-on AF features. One of the things that I wanted to do with the A9 after getting back from Japan was to replace some of the movies which specifically looked at setting up the camera for fast action, including the new tracking features. So just a few days ago, I pushed out a 50-minute movie which looks at setting up the A9 for fast action. Even if you don't have the A9 camera, it is probably worth looking at this type of movie if you're wondering what will happen in the next generation of Sony cameras and how they deal with fast action. Remember, the A9 is the only interchangeable lens currently available that has that stacked backlit illuminated sensor that gives us that opportunity for zero blackout between frames. But I don't think Sony will hold this sensor technology back for much longer. I can only see it being rolled out over other cameras. There were some questions online about whether the tracking would come to the A7 III and A7R III. But I suspect, and Sony's made no statement about this, but I do suspect that it's processor dependent, and the processor, the Beyond's X processor in the A9, is quite a lot faster than the A7 III and the A7R III. They're all called Beyond's X processors, but Sony don't list the clock speed of these processors. And I think one of the unusual things that happened with the A6400 is it appears that it's probably got the processor from the A9 camera in basically what is a mid-level camera in the APS-C range. Okay, so one of the things that I've noticed, I've picked up a couple of questions in forums, is pre-AF, and I've got a slide later on, which if you have bought one of the A6400 cameras and you're having a little bit of trouble with using that as a sports action camera, just check that pre-AF setting. It was on when I got my pre-production camera, but I've seen another couple of people having problems where the AF system is selecting an object without you pressing or half pressing the shutter release. So you do want to sort of make sure that pre-AF is off. I think Sony might have put it on because the A6400 has sort of an identity crisis. It was also marketed as a vlogger's camera, and when you're pointing the camera at yourself, having pre-AF on is a slight advantage to that workflow, but it does work against you if you're using that A6400 for capturing fast-moving action. Okay, so and then I also, of course, having updated the movies, I then had to go into the A9 book and update all of the links. And this A9 book has grown over the subsequent releases from, I think, 160 pages. Now it's sitting around the 245 page mark. So that was the weeks that have just passed since I've been back from Japan, is making sure all of my educational resources. People often ask me whether I'll cover other models, older models, such as the version 2 full frame cameras, or maybe the 6000, 6300, 6500. But I do suspect if Sony drop another couple of cameras this year, my work will be cut out for me for the rest of the year, just keeping up with the newer models. Okay, so, and of course, as soon as I updated the movies, then I had to update the playlists, removing some of the old movies from the A9 playlist and replacing them. One of the other movies that I had to replace was Sony have changed the way the custom white balance works in the A6400 and the A9 cameras. It's not a significant difference, but of course, I didn't want to confuse people by looking at a movie where some of the features have moved menus. So I went in and replaced those movies as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the next group of images that I wanted to discuss. Okay, so if you are watching online and the chat pod, it looks empty to me, and it's not the first time that chat pod has not had any questions in, and then I've finished this seminar and then I can see the questions. So if you are watching, you might just want to type something into the chat pod, so I know I'm not talking to myself, just in case this Google Hangout has failed. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the slides from some of the resources that I've just been updating, and I've just been talking about that pre-AF option, and obviously depending on the camera you're using. Okay, Rick, thank you for letting me know somebody's watching. We do have over 100 members now on this what I call the inner circle, people who are signing up so they can get all of their questions answered. It's getting harder and harder to answer everybody's questions, both in Facebook forums and on YouTube. I once replied to somebody who emailed me saying that if everybody every one of my followers on YouTube just asked me one question per year, that's all I'd be doing all day, is answering people's questions. And although Sony are very supportive, providing me with equipment and getting me to talk at their events, they don't actually support me with any of this social media support. This is all something that I've chosen to do as an ambassador. It's not part of my contract. Okay, I digress. So we're talking about that pre-AF. It will change page or menu or tabs depending on what camera you're using, but that pre-AF is one to watch. If you are setting up, for instance, a 10-second delay and you're going to run in front of the into a group, so you can get a group setting, pre-AF on is actually quite a useful feature. But I would always remember to switch it off after doing those group selfie shots, because pre-AF is a big drain on battery, and as I said, it does interfere with tracking and lock-on when we're using sport action photography. Okay, so one of the questions I continue to get asked is in regard to my technique for shooting fast action. And when subject matter is coming towards me, I typically use my memory default, which starts at 1/2000th of a second, which is usually fast enough to freeze anything. I control the shutter speed, however, in aperture priority by using ISO auto minimum shutter speed. And some people constantly ask me, why not use shutter priority or manual exposure with a predefined ISO setting or auto ISO? And there are several reasons which I've outlined in my ISO auto minimum shutter speed. And one of those reasons is if you're in shutter priority and you let the aperture roll, then you can find on your camera it will roll smaller aperture on the camera, and then you can cut out phase detect autofocus. To give you an example, the A7R III can't use apertures smaller than f8. You can't use f11, f16, f22 and have that focus continuing to track as a subject changes distance. It's slightly better on the A7 III, which is f11, and it used to be f11 on the A9, but it's changed with the firmware upgrade to f16. Okay, so when I'm choosing a very slow shutter speed, maybe 1/250th in sunny weather, you do have to make sure that you're not closing that aperture down below what the camera can use to do phase detect autofocus. It's a little bit complicated, but that is my preferred setting. It's not the only setting. I don't want to preach to people about what settings they should use, but it is my preferred setting because it does protect me. After watching ISO auto minimum shutter speed movies, some people will be setting it up in their office or studio at night, and then they hold the camera to the eye, and the shutter speed is saying 1/30th of a second. And that is one of the advantages of ISO auto minimum shutter speed, is it preserves and protects appropriate exposure. And so if there isn't enough light to hit that 1/2000th of a second, it will slow down so you get the appropriate exposure. And this is one of the things that's not protected by the other workflows, such as shutter priority or a manual using auto ISO. You can find yourself underexposing or overexposing depending on the ambient light conditions. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I can answer questions in the forums to make sure that you fully understand that particular workflow, and all I can suggest is that you try it and see how you get on with it. Okay, one of the a lot of people also think that my recommended settings that I program into the memories, memory 1, 2, and possibly 3, if you have it on your camera, I don't use those as straitjacket settings. I don't only use those settings for shooting that group of images or in that genre. They're just starting point settings, and there are some instances where I don't use auto exposure for fast action. And so this slide that I've just included in my update for my A9 basically highlights that occasionally, depending on the situation that I'm photographing in, I will use manual exposure, including a fixed ISO setting when shooting birds in flight. It's predominantly the birds in flight that has it. Generally, we're looking at capturing something that is usually backlit in the sky, and so we would normally have to do an exposure compensation +1 or more if we were using auto ISO. But then when you're tracking a bird in flight and the bird starts flying in front of dark trees, the auto exposure will jump massively and then overexpose the main subject. So in some instances where the light isn't changing, we're on basically a sunny day, it's okay just to check or set the most appropriate exposure for the ambient light, and then not change that. So long as the subject isn't going in and out of shade and into the sun, then choosing a manual exposure might be the most appropriate. Now, for an action settings for if you wanted to set up a camera just with 3 differences in action settings, 1 for freezing action, 1 for blurring backgrounds, 3 for manual exposure. One of the manual exposure memory settings I would typically set would be for sunny weather, and that would be 1/2000th of a second, f5.6, ISO 320. Now, if I dial that in and the sun's not out, I'm going to have to pretty much double that ISO or double it again in order to set the camera exposure settings for the ambient light. I'll then take one test shot just to make sure the white clouds in the sky are not clipping, and then I'd start using that exposure. Okay, hi Armin. Glad you could join us this morning. Well, it's this morning in Melbourne. If you're in the States, it could be any time. So I apologize for the people in Europe. You're probably looking at a midnight session. It's hard to pick a time that's suitable for everybody on the globe. This is the best that I could do. So I'm glad that a lot of people could join me. Okay, so one of the questions I got in the May question and answers was to do with the select media on page 3 of the first camera setup menu, and that was to do select media. Now, in front of those 3 menu items, recall, memory, select media, you will see the letters MR. They're all associated to memory recall. So somebody was noticing that it didn't matter whether they set slot 1 or slot 2, it didn't change where the images were being recorded to, and that's not the purpose of these 3 menu items. If you're looking to get to grips with these 3 menu items, you would want to watch my Total Recall movie. This is about where we save memories to which card, because we can save 2 or 3 to the camera, but we can save 4 more to a memory card. So when we choose slot 2, we're going to be saving them to the upper card slot on the 3rd generation of A7 cameras and the A9 camera. And the recall basically will also recall from that memory card slot. So I typically change it from slot 1 to slot 2 because I will be reformatting slot 1 card more often. And you have to remember that if you do save any memories to a memory card, they are removed when you reformat the card. So hopefully that clarifies that. And if you're still a bit unsure about those memory items, just take a look at that Total Recall movie. Okay, so there are the M settings, M1, M2, M3, M4. You can actually back up those memories that you've saved to your computer. So if you do reformat that card in the top slot, you can basically just put them back onto the card after you've reformatted that card. I will typically just carry a very small card in the a small capacity card in my camera bag with 4 additional settings. And I also have to add that once you do a major firmware upgrade, you will have to do those settings again, because generally you can't use older memory settings if the firmware has changed significantly, and that was the case with the version 5 firmware for the A9 camera. Okay, so the other thing that the A9 had upgraded, and it was long overdue because it was available on the A7 III and A7R3 cameras, was the record media settings had a lot more options in these cameras than the A9 had, which was a little bit frustrating, as the A9 is the most expensive and premium model camera. But fortunately now the A9 has caught up. But having said that, I've caught a few questions on social media channels which show that some people are a little bit confused about these record media settings. Some people were ejecting the card from the top slot, thinking that would increase the performance of the lower slot. And that's a workflow that you don't have to engage in. So long as you have the recording mode set to standard, you will only be recording 1 set of files to the slot 1, the fastest slot, and any card that you put into slot 2 won't slow down the performance of slot 1. Okay, if you choose the recording mode as simultaneous because you need an insurance backup should the lower card fail, and that is very rare, it does happen, but I haven't had it happen in years. But if that is something you're doing because maybe you're doing a wedding shoot or whatever, then you will work to the card performance of that upper slot and so that is where the camera does slow down. So most sports photographers won't be doing that. They won't be sending a duplicate set of files or movies to slot 2. They'll just be recording one set of images to that slot 1. Now, the important thing that happened with the A9, and I've just moved slide there so you can see it, is that auto switch media. So in a long continuous burst of images, if that lower slot fills up, it will just automatically start recording to the upper slot. And in between activities, you can then just swap the 2 cards around or put a new card in that lower slot. Okay, so Armin says 7 p.m. in Eastern USA. So, well, that's not too radical a different time. So hopefully that's good. We're just going into winter in Australia. So, but we've got a sunny morning here in Melbourne. So, just got a few more warm days before winter kicks in. And yes, we do have a winter in the southernmost parts of Australia here. Obviously, the top end of Australia doesn't really have a winter at all, but I'm not living in that area. Okay, so that concludes that group of slides. So I'll just pick up the next group. Okay, and this is really about things that have been released or are being released as we speak. Now, one of the Sony products that I'm waiting on now, I hopefully will get it in the next week or 2, is this wireless remote commander. Now, one of the significant differences between this wireless remote and previous wireless remotes is, 1, it is wireless, and 2, it doesn't work off an infrared signal like the previous wireless commander. This will be working off a Bluetooth connection. So, and there are certain advantages to this, and you can see from some of the button configurations is, for instance, we have a C1 button. So a C1 button would presumably trigger off anything that you've assigned to your C1 custom button. And we can also use those plus minus buttons for moving focus, and that might be useful for somebody as well. Also, you can switch over to zoom if you wanted to move zoom. I'm looking at hopefully doing a review on this product as I get one, so just watch out for that on the YouTube channel. Something that's not a Sony product, but I've seen a lot of news about this tripod. It's from Peak Design. Now, I'm a bit of a fan of some Peak Design straps. Not all Peak Design straps, but a particular strap that I use, which is very grippy on the shoulder. Some of the very thin ones are not grippy at all, and the camera just slides off your shoulder. But the broader one is good. And one of the things that I like about the Peak Design straps is their quick release system. So if I've got working with 2 camera bodies at maybe a sports event, I don't get a tangle with my bag and not be able to get a camera off my shoulder because the straps are crossed. I can quickly release the quick release points and basically reconfigure the straps. Some people are fans of their bags as well. I don't own a Peak Design bag, but they seem to be well thought out from the ones that I've seen. And now we've got tripods from Peak Design. I have to say, when it said that it was very small, it doesn't look that small in that picture. And I've noticed it's a little bit heavier than my lightweight tripod that I'm carrying. So, and they're also very expensive. So I'm slightly skeptical. I'm not going to rush out and put an order in yet. But look, if you're used to using large tripods and that's a weight saving for you, then that might be a great addition. I'm always looking to shave weight off. I'm currently using a couple of carbon fiber tripods that are sitting just over the 1 kilo mark. Admittedly, they're not super high, but my favorite vantage point for shooting landscapes is very low. So I don't always need a tripod that will extend to eye height without me having to crouch. Okay, so again, it's something that you may be interested in taking a look at. The carbon fiber one is quite pricey, I have to say. I've seen some of the prices for those. This is a picture that was taken of me in Western Australia on some sand dunes. I was co-tutor at a group. There was about 20 of us in the sand dunes in Western Australia. I immediately pointed out myself to somebody who was looking at this photograph, and they said, how do you know that that's you? And I said, I'm the one who's not carrying a backpack and is using a smaller tripod. And so I'm in the middle, basically, because I do like to travel light, and I typically work with a messenger bag. Now, if I can't get everything in a messenger bag because I'm running 2 camera bodies and more than 3 lenses, then I'll typically just add a second messenger bag rather than a backpack. I've just fallen out of love with backpacks because I use them for a long time, and now I prefer to be traveling lighter. It's one of the joys of perhaps mirrorless and some of the smaller Sony lenses. And the second camera that I have been using recently is the 6400. I'm a little bit having a bit of a love affair with that 6400 APS-C camera. Normally I just take 2 full frame bodies, but this is the first time I've used an APS-C camera for a very extended period of time. Okay, so on the camera front, we have a Fuji film full frame camera. So sorry, that's a sort of I think that's a medium format camera, not a full frame. They have their APS-C Fujifilm. One of the comparisons is they've compared this with the large professional cameras from Nikon, the D5 and the EOS 1DX Mark II, and you can see that's a sizable camera. When compared to an A7R3, you can see how big that camera actually is. I think it's more than double the weight of the A7R3. And the lenses having to service that camera is also going to be significantly larger as well. I have no interest, apart from it not being a Sony, I would have no interest in running with cameras that large anymore. Some people will. It's an interesting camera to have on the market, but just that that size comparison really frightens me. I don't want to be carrying such heavy weights anymore, especially with the performance that I'm getting. Interestingly, we're seeing some of the higher resolution cameras, the over 100 megapixel cameras coming out. Is the pixel density there would equate to a 60 megapixel full frame sensor. And given that Sony often make these sensors for other manufacturers, it's probably reasonable to expect that in the next generation of R cameras, full frame R cameras from Sony, we might be heading over 50 megapixels. And they've always said that their GM lenses are designed to go up into ever-increasing resolutions. So we're future-proofing ourselves by buying those GM lenses. Okay, so another full-frame camera has come from Panasonic. This is a little bit more of an interesting camera. One of the reasons this is more interesting is Panasonic, who make Lumix are a sensor manufacturer. So it's almost certain to say that that sensor inside that camera is not made by Sony. So it shows that really for Sony, I would think that Canon and Nikon are not the natural competitors for Sony as we move forward. It's more likely to be Panasonic. Now, they've got the Micro Four Thirds system, but people who are really looking for the advantages of running full frame would certainly may be interested in that S1. Again, it's slightly larger for people who complain about the full frame cameras from Sony are a little bit too small. That might be of interest. They've already tested this sensor as being slightly behind on dynamic range compared to the Sony. So, but I suspect it's a good sensor. I also suspect that the AF systems of the current generation of full frame cameras is slightly superior on those Sony cameras. Okay, so let's just close that and move on to the next set of images that I wanted to discuss. Okay, so this is about what's been happening in the news, and I'm always interested in hearing the news about Adobe. I'm not Adobe ambassador anymore. I was an ambassador for 14 years, but they don't currently have an ambassador program in the Asia Pacific region. But I often see, I'm often curious and often see when somebody reports on Adobe News, and you see the comments, very aggressive, angry comments about people who are very angry with Adobe. It's always slightly bizarre, I think, because you always have the choice not to use Adobe. But one of the pieces of news that came out recently was that Adobe warns that using older CC apps could get you sued. I don't think they actually use the language in their advice to photographers. Basically, some of the coding they were using in some of their versions of older versions of their CC apps were licensed for a period of time. So when that license expires and you're still using that software, technically speaking, you would be breaking a licensing agreement. Whether a large company would sue you as an individual for using that software is unlikely. Adobe, I don't think, have ever sued an individual for running pirate software, for instance. And in nowhere in that information was saying that Adobe would sue you. But of course, people jump to conclusions, thinking if Adobe are going to sue me, then I'm going to turn my back on Adobe software and start using Capture One or whatever. And so people sort of jump to conclusions just because Sony were warning that older apps are no longer fully licensed. Having said that, and if you asked anybody who's running, who hasn't upgraded their Lightroom or Photoshop for the last 2 or 3 years, if you try and find anybody who's running a CC version that's 3 or 4 years old, you would struggle. And so it's a bit of a storm in a teacup, if you've heard of that expression, as far as I could see. And so if you ever do try to install an older version, rather than seeing all of the old versions now, you'll only see maybe 2, 3, 4 older versions. Now, I've only ever once advised people to backtrack, uninstall the current version and go back to the previous version. And that was a couple of years ago again, when a Lightroom version came out that was incredibly buggy. And the engineers had missed these bugs, and so I said they'll fix them, but just roll back one version until that happens and then upgrade again. Okay, so the other news that preceded this one, again, Adobe and Petapixel love to have these clickbait articles, was, and they actually rephrased some of the articles. The original article said that Adobe was doubling the price and then pointing to a product that had already existed and was exactly the same price, and that is the 1 terabyte version of cloud storage going with Lightroom and Photoshop. And that actually hadn't changed. What had changed was the $9.99 version had mysteriously disappeared from the American site, and it's there, and it's back there now. And no one really knew why Adobe did that. Maybe they were testing the market, or maybe it was just a web developer's error, because it never really disappeared off the Australian site. It was always the basic version of that package. The Lightroom, often referred to as the photographer's plan, was always available. And again, this created a lot of heated debate online. People talking about money grabbing Adobe, and again, people saying, oh, I'm going to jump to Capture One. One of the things that are always I find curious about that thing is, as a photographer, I predominantly use Lightroom for cataloging and editing, but there are certain things that I can only do in Photoshop, so I can never really live without Photoshop. And if I have Photoshop, that means I have Lightroom. And so buying Capture One would mean a second purchase. I actually have Capture One. Having said that, I actually have made that purchase because I do need to keep up to speed with what Capture One are doing as well. And for people who need a live view whilst tethering, then Capture One is a good product. I have nothing against Capture One as a product, but if you already own Lightroom because you needed Photoshop, then it's something to consider that Capture One would be an additional purchase for many photographers. Now, you'll see lots of advocates online saying Capture One is a better product. And when I was an Adobe ambassador, I always said, how? Because there is no proven instance that it creates images that are sharper, with less noise, or with more dynamic range. Those are all constraints usually held by the camera itself. Affinity Photo, Rick Bradley says, I actually don't have a lot of time to invest in too many other products. I briefly looked at, I think it was a Luminar or something. I looked at another product, but it didn't have a cataloging system. So I sort of said, I'll put that on the later basket. One of the things that I have noticed, because I'm quite an old fella, is I was originally using Photoshop when it first came out, and I've seen lots of products compete and then disappear. And people have invested thousands of hours in getting up to speed and acquiring skills and cataloging stuff, and then only to have the product disappear. And all of that work that you've invested is of no use whatsoever. The biggest upset was around Apple's Aperture, which completely disappeared, wasn't upgraded with a new operating system, and so people had to remove their entire catalog and then import it into something new, such as Lightroom. So all of their raw files came into Lightroom in their raw state, unedited, and that is something that I could possibly never entertain. Adobe, I say, Capture One is the one that's had the longest lifespan of any product, and it's the only one that I would possibly trust to be there for the long haul. Now you have to remember that Adobe actually predates the first DSLR, so they've been around for a very long time. Adobe were responsible for designing the software that could display the first digital image on a computer monitor, and so they've been a big cornerstone of digital imaging since its infancy. So even though a lot of people love to hate Adobe, I do have to respect their contribution to digital imaging. Which is a lot of people don't really understand. I often ask people, if you just look on your camera menu and ask them, why does Adobe 1998 appear in your camera's menu? And I'm not going to spoil that. You're just going to have to Google that one to find out. Or you could watch my color management video if you're interested to see why all cameras, all interchangeable lens cameras, have a menu option called Adobe RGB 1998, and that 1998 is a date. Okay, so and there you go. So a lot of people are looking at alternatives to Lightroom, but just remember by far and away the most advanced engine for manipulation, doing compositing, skin retouching. It's all in Photoshop. It's not in Capture One. It's not in Affinity. It's not in Lightroom. It's basically the engine that is been around for the longest, and is the most sophisticated engine for advanced work on pixel images is Photoshop, and that will always be the case. They have too much invested in that software program to let anyone come anywhere near that. Anybody who develops a piece of coding that competes with it at all, Adobe usually just goes out and acquires the engineers or buys the technology. Okay, so you'll see a lot of negative reports, but just always temper that. They are a business; they do have to make money, but do they warrant all the hate? That is something for you to decide. Here's one of the strangest news items over the last month: is Ricoh, who make Pentax cameras, believe that mirrorless is a passing fad, and we'll all go back to DSLRs. If I had any shares in Ricoh, I would be selling them right now. That is one of the most bizarre statements I've currently heard. Sony, when they acquired Minolta, saw the mirror as a sort of a block or a barrier to getting absolute optimal performance for autofocus systems, for movie capture. So, and that's their big push for mirrorless. Was mirrorless were in catch-up with DSLRs for many years, and sort of now we're sort of arriving at an era where mirrorless cameras can outperform DSLRs, and that will only continue along that route. So a very bizarre statement from Ricoh there. Okay, so and one of the things that I would see for the future is that some of the interchangeable lens cameras, some of the focus moves away from full frame as we move forward and go into smaller sensors such as APS-C and micro four thirds. Sony of not being too busy in this market, but at Photokina last year, they did say that in 2019 we would see some movement in their APS-C market, and the 6400 was their first offering, which has absolutely stellar AF performance for shooting fast action. So admittedly, it doesn't have, it's not linked to a big buffer. It's not linked to that stacked backlit illuminated sensor. So we do have blackout. But this isn't going to be the only new APS-C camera that we see in 2019. So I would expect the camera that replaces the A6500 to raise a few eyebrows. And for people who are looking at carrying less weight, if Sony follow through and create more APS-C lenses, then we could look at an era where some people have the choice whether you want absolute IQ, full frame, or less weight and go for an APS-C system. And that's one of the reasons I've been using the A6400 for a couple of months now is if Sony say that 2019 is going to be the year of the APS-C, then I'm going to spend some time building support resources for that community that will follow. Okay, take a look at that A6400. I'm not going to comment on the vlogging capability, but if you're interested in shooting things that move, the A6400 is quite a remarkable camera. Okay, so just a question from Albert. Are you using the Sony FE2470 2.8? Okay, so that's the 2470 2.8. I was a GM, and I did own that lens. But because I own a lot of wide aperture primes, I could actually get slightly better IQ and slightly wider apertures by using a prime. We have the 24 1.4, we have 55 1.8, we have the 85 1.8. So because I had all of those primes, I decided I would get rid of the 2470 GM and actually go for a 24 105 f4. I know it's got a small, it doesn't have that wide aperture, but I do have those wide apertures on the primes. And so it was a way of shaving off weight on a full frame system. I do travel a lot and often getting all of the camera gear into my carry-on luggage. In America, you don't tend to have weight limits on your carry-on, but in the rest of the world, we have to pack down to 7 kilos, and that includes the bag. Now, I carry a laptop bag as well with 2 or 3 lenses in there as well. So I can carry typically about 10 kilos worth of camera gear, and that's the maximum. So that is one of the things that I have to work with. And so some lenses that I would love to take, I often leave at home. An example of that is I usually travel with the 85 1.8 and leave that beautiful 85 1.4 GM lens at home because of the weight again. So it often is a compromise what I travel with, choosing what it is that I'm shooting and what cameras that I'm prepared to take and what lenses. Okay, so let's just close that and go on to the next folder of images. I don't think we're going to get through all of these. I've obviously got too much content for today, but better to have more content than not enough. One of the things that I added in an upgrade to my A7R3 book, and if you haven't downloaded that upgrade, was some discussion about high ISO. One of the things that I often get asked when I'm showcasing some images is some people can't believe that I actually shot certain images at such high ISOs because they look clean on a 4K screen or a big data projector with high resolution. For instance, this little tree frog that I shot in a rainforest retreat was shot at 5000 ISO on a 100-400 GM lens at 400 mil. Because of the close focusing distance of the 100-400, I often prefer to shoot small things, not really small things, but small things with a 400 rather than a macro lens. A lot of the AF performance of the 90mm macro is a little bit slow, and so I prefer the snappier focus when using the 400mm. And this image is barely cropped at all, so you can see I can get quite close to a very small tree frog and fill the frame. Okay, but the reason I'm showing you this image is the way I treat noise reduction. I have high ISO noise reduction switched off in camera because I prefer the noise reduction in post-production, and I'll typically add 15 or 20 noise reduction globally. Where I get rid of most of the noise is in a localized noise reduction, and this follows up with maybe a radial filter I'm working on the outside, that red masking area showing where the noise reduction is taking place, and I'll ramp that noise reduction up to +80 or +100. We have a new texture slider in the latest version of Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, and so you could also try experimenting with reducing the texture, basically smoothing out the bokeh. And it's the bokeh where the noise is most people most aware that it is a high ISO image, is in those out of focus, smooth toned areas. You know, if a sky would be included in that. And so if we can apply heavy amounts of noise reduction to those areas, we can hide the fact that it was such a high ISO image. So long as you protect the primary subject, which is sharp, from high levels of noise reduction, because you will erode detail by using high levels of noise reduction on your primary subject. And so we get to an instance like this. This is an unprocessed raw file shot at 8000 ISO, same rainforest retreat. Notice also the histogram that I've added an inset there is one of the things that also makes high ISO even worse, is if you slightly underexpose, then you have to add 1 or 2 stops brighter in post-production. And so just make sure you're not underexposing your high ISO images. In fact, it's better to push the ISO a little bit more than underexpose. Now, Sony cameras are very tolerant with this, but this is a rule of thumb that I found, is try to keep the dark shadows off that left-hand wall if you possibly can. And there's the processed view. Now, this would go double page spread in any magazine, and people would say, you know, was that shot at 400 ISO or 200 ISO? And in fact, it's shot at 8000 ISO. Okay, so let's close those images, move on to the next one. Okay, so a question that came in just an hour or two before we went live was the subject of choosing a lens for landscape. Now, some people often refer to as the wider focal length lenses as landscape lenses, typically a 16-35 on a full frame camera, maybe a 10-18 on an APS-C camera would be ideal. Zooms or an ultra wide angle prime lens would be good choices for, you know, your typical landscape. I'm saying typical because you can shoot landscapes with any focal length, but what a lot of people try and do with landscape photography is build depth. So they build in some foreground interest, such as this beach on this lake in the Rocky Mountains, and then we push out to the background, and we can usually pull depth of field from, you know, say using f11, so we get the foreground sharp and the distance sharp. This is something that you don't tend to do with longer telephoto lenses. You can't get everything in focus, and you'd have to start looking at techniques such as focus stacking, etc. So this is the traditional landscape genre. Here's an image that I captured with a 24-105 with the camera basically sitting on the road. Now, I did tell you earlier about those big tripods. I do often put the cameras just on tabletop tripods on the ground because I do like that low vantage point when shooting landscapes. You can't shoot every landscape using that low vantage point, but I suspect that the vast majority of my landscapes are very low to the ground. And there's the other thing that happens when you're using these landscapes with wide angle lenses is you build in steep perspective. Things tend to recede very quickly into the background, and you get that sense of drama from that steep perspective. Having said that, you know, this was shot with a 400mm lens with a teleconverter on, and what this does is it flattens out perspective. So we start looking at landscape as more of a pattern or texture, not as a journey through from foreground to background. And this is equally valid depending on what you're trying to communicate with your images. And a lot of the Australian bush, which is fairly inimpenetrable, a lot of people think the creatures are the ones that are going to kill you when you come to Australia, but often it's the landscape because people get lost in the forests and never resurface. And so trying to communicate how impenetrable the Australian bush can be is often expressed more clearly using a long telephoto lens. Okay, so Penfix, this will be recorded, so you'll be able to catch up with the last 10 or 15 minutes later. So thanks for letting me know. Okay, so and here's another example showing that flattened out perspective using telephoto lenses. Okay, so let's moving on to things that I've been shooting just recently. I think we might go 10 minutes over if you can bear with me. That's if you're prepared. That if you do have to go, this will be recorded. Okay, so we're in the dunes in Western Australia. The dunes aren't as big or as grand as the Sahara, but for me, they're big enough, especially when you have to climb them. And we got some really good opportunities in Western Australia. This was on a workshop I was doing with World Photo Adventures. Now, I wanted to show you an unprocessed image. Now, I won't say this is how I saw this landscape. This is how the camera interpreted this landscape, but I did want to show you an unprocessed view. Now I'm using the 6400 camera here. I'm using it at the base level ISO, and you can see the histogram there. It's pretty much it's not expanded out to a black point and a white point. And we're looking at white sand and bright sky, and there is no black point and typically no white point either. If it is white sand, you'll find most cameras start underexposing by a stop, so that is something to be aware of. You might want to use exposure compensation to add one stop. Generally speaking, you get better quality if you can raise your exposure slightly and keep any shadows off the back wall. No danger of this one. The shadows are a very long way from that back wall on this histogram. Next thing in post-production is to process it in a way that communicates maybe mood or emotion or how I felt about this landscape. So this is one interpretation. This is just adding contrast, adding a black point and a white point and expanding that out. Now, is that closer to what I was visualizing here? It sort of visualizes the drama of the sun passing over the shapes of the sand dunes, but perhaps the contrast in this instance is a little bit high from what I was actually seeing. So it communicates more about how I felt about light and shade, but probably is less realistic to the interpretation. But how much do we value realism in photography, and do we sacrifice expression? And that is often where photography is considered an art form, is because we're not just using the camera as a mirror with a memory. That's an old expression of photography, but we're using it as a vehicle to collect information that we can then modify to express our personal opinion or view as to what it is we're photographing. And that is where photography can move from a record into an artistic medium. So is there anything to say this interpretation of that exact same photograph is wrong or right? This is where I've not corrected the contrast, and I've actually started opening up the shadows so they're lighter, and I've also skewed the hue of the sky more to a cyan. I've seen lots of architectural photographers do this to add sort of a signature style to what they're doing. So was this my favorite rendition of this scene? Okay, or is this one, as the sun was getting lower and we're getting some warmth from the late afternoon sun and the temperatures were up into the mid-20s, so should we lean a little bit of warmth into the color because I'm feeling warm and I've been walking through deep sand dunes, so I'm working up a bit of a sweat. So I've actually made this less neutral and more warm. I've actually also worked with a little bit of the flare that's creeping into the corner. I just noticed that flare coming in, and rather trying to just angle the camera to exclude it, I angled the camera to include more of it. That was sort of, I noticed the flare was dropping down onto the character who is Darren Leal. He's the other tour group leader I was working with. So that's just, again, another way of creating a communication. And here's an unprocessed image as we were walking back towards the road system to pick up the four-wheel drive. And this is an unedited version and only a slight modification now. And this was just to swing the shadows more blue to highlight the warmth of the light hitting that peak of that the shrub and on top of that sand there with a little bit more warmth to highlight that. And that just draws the viewer's eye more quickly over to the focal point. It's a little bit like dodging and burning, but using color difference instead of tonal difference. For people who want absolute accurate color, there is a way of achieving this, and that is not to trust to the camera profiles that the software use, whether it's Capture One or Lightroom, but simply to create a profile that is specific for your camera. And this is an X-Rite color checker. And I discussed this in a little bit more depth in my color management movie. Okay, so let's come out. I did want to go through one more section, and and that is the dunes. So as I said, we'll go 10 minutes over because this was my pièce de resistance for this 1 hour workshop, so I'm not going to cut you short now. So this is not my image, and this is just a screen grab that I found online. It's of an Ansel Adams image. It's you can see the format. It's actually working with large format film, and Ansel Adams started enjoying the beauty of detail and using the depth of field. He belonged to a group of photographers who called themselves the F64 group, and basically shooting everything large format F64, and created these marvelous images in black and white. And he had absolute control over tone. He invented the zone system, so there was no accident of tone. Everything was pre-planned, pre-visualized. When I went to the dunes, although I worked with a little bit of the color, as we could see before, all I could see was this image that had burnt its way into my brain over the decades. And this is sort of what I wanted to use the dunes as a vehicle for. So immediately when I got back from the shoot, I started creating black and white images. Now, one of the things that you should be aware of with the more recent updates with Lightroom is we now have profiles. And now they moved from Adobe Standard to Adobe Color, but we've also got many more creative profiles. So if you're looking for that one-click preset just to get an idea of what it could look like, because you don't want to start moving sliders yet, we've got a dozen, well, 17 there. I've just seen the number, 17 black and white profiles. We've also got the traditional ones of using the old color filters that we used to use when using black and white film. So you can sort of click through these and look at varieties before we actually move any sliders whatsoever. So I'm just clicking on black and white 3 profile, getting that glorious black and white conversion now, and you can see that I'm really chasing that Ansel Adams look. And so we can follow up by going into the black and white panel and then start darkening skies or lightening sand and have a control over how color is rendered as a specific tone in the image, which we used to do with color filters in front of the lenses. I'll also work with graduated filters. I'll typically maybe darken the foreground slightly, darken the skies. Ansel Adams was very fond of dark skies, which would draw people into the subject in the center of the image or around the image, but not the sky. So acting like bookends to the detail that we want the viewer to look at. So I'd be working with those graduated filters as well. And there's the original image. Okay, so you can see for me, the color was less important than the light and shade. Whenever you're dealing with subjects that are more about how light moves across form, then often people will use that as a vehicle for black and white. And there is the final produced image. I even moved away from the 3:2 aspect ratio to sort of emulate the squarer ratio that people would normally associate with the old school large format black and white images. So there you go. There's my view. This is Darren again, and this is how I would treat it in black and white. Slightly higher key now, rendering the sand as bright as perhaps it was, but we're really getting that figure standing out from there. So less about light and shade, although we've got a nice shadow coming off Darren there. So again, worked quite well in black and white. Here's an unprocessed view of one of the dunes as the sun is getting a little bit lower, and there's the black and white rendition. I decided not to go completely out and actually assign a white point. It's one of those few instances where I don't actually snap out the histogram so it extends from the complete left to the right sides. I actually had the white point slightly down so we could just see a little bit more detail into those highlights, as well as just dragging the highlight slider to the left as well. And here's Darren. He's just descended that sand dune ridge there, and you can see the sand blowing off that ridge because he's been disturbing the sand. And by processing that image, I can highlight the sand blowing off that ridge in with greater control than maybe I could in color. You may want to use maybe a brush tool with dehaze loaded as well, just to try and enhance and maybe more clarity, just to enhance that localized contrast in those areas. So basically showcasing what I want you to look at, and which is a big strength of black and white. And there you can see some of my settings in Lightroom there. The highlights are down to -100 and the shadows up to 75, and using the black and white with yellow filter, which will darken the blue sky slightly. Okay, so there you can see how I've approached that. I'm not afraid of moving sliders in the basic panel all of the way to their extremes. And so one of the things that you should be adventurous with is being a little bit aggressive sometimes, just to see what a slider will do. And there's this is one of my favorite images. I love those swirls on the left hand side of the dunes here. And after we'd all photographed the dunes, we invited somebody in the tour group to go and march into the image and basically break up the image and give a sense of scale. There is a tradition of using a character in landscape just to show scale and the human proportions. And with black and white, we can actually often darken the shadows off to suppress information in the shadows, which really make use now of that that light area and the figure moving into that light. Okay, and again you can see with that -1 stop exposure in the settings here, trying to keep the exposure quite high so we can always lower it in post. That's usually a typical workflow for optimum quality. It's a workflow called expose to the right, which you can Google and look up more information about that. If you're wanting to get more control in your black and white processing, just go to downloads on my website, tutorials, and you'll see develop create dramatic black and white conversion in Lightroom. This will go into a lot of detail about how I would control. You can never just do one click to get the perfect black and white conversion, because black and white is more of a narrative. It's about you deciding what you want to make darker, what you want to make lighter, how you guide the viewer's attention over and around your image. And this does require the old school workflows that we all, I learned in a dark room, which is dodging and burning. So you can download the image featured in this tutorial, so you can follow along step by step and work your way through. And the idea is make your image look like my image, and then try and practice the same techniques on your own images. Okay, so if you are interested in getting into dunes with me on a one-to-one relationship, I think there is an opportunity. I think there's only 2 places left from memory, and that is to work with me in September in Death Valley. And not only will we'll have the dunes, but you're just slightly behind this image that you can see, we also have the Sierra Nevada mountains. So a fabulous place to exercise these skills, both on location and also when we return back each evening and then start working the images in post-production. Okay, if you're wanting to come over to Australia, because you're not in Australia, and work with me in Australia, I have one more tour that I'll be doing this year, and that is on the Great Barrier Reef. It's on a coral cay, small coral cay. The coral cay is about as big as the light aircraft landing strips, very small coral cay on the southernmost end of the Great Barrier Reef. And there is so much wildlife on this, and so there are a few places left on this tour as well. And I'll be working with a Sony advocate, a guy called Fraser Leal, on this particular, also from World Photo Adventures. Okay, so that sort of ends. I've gone 7 minutes over, but hope you don't mind going slightly over. I'll sign off there, but if you've got any questions outstanding, then just add them to the forum. I'll create a new thread in June for all of the questions to go there. And I do prioritize these questions. I can't get to every question anymore on YouTube, but I will prioritize what I refer to as my inner circle, my paid members of this group. And don't be afraid of asking 6 questions or 10 questions. This is what it's for. I want to be your personal consultant. You're valuing my time by paying me, and I want to prioritize getting you up to speed. Everybody becomes a Sony ambassador if we're starting to produce fabulous images with our cameras, and that is my goal: is to make you a master of your camera, and so the camera becomes a tool for you to be very creative. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I'll just cancel out. So let's just come and so I'll sign off, and I'll catch you next month. I'm not too sure of the date. Again, I'm going interstate on a photo trip, so but I will catch up with you next month, and I'll try and pick an agenda. Who knows what Sony products will be released that I'll be reviewing, and I can give you first-hand experience of how I'm finding those. Okay, thanks for watching.